Well, hello. So glad we get the opportunity to continue our study of the book of Ruth, taking a deep dive into this short book that is just packed with good application and some beautiful application of how we as God's people should be treating not just our relationship with God, but our relationships with one another. We got a chance to introduce the book last time, talk about the first chapter. This time we're going to dive into chapter 2 and really start to see kind of the main focus of the story in the relationship between Ruth and Boaz. So joined once again by Greg Kline from Birmingham, Alabama, Trey Haskett from Tupelo, Mississippi. Very glad to have both these guys with us. Excited to dive into this. So we're going to go ahead and start in Ruth chapter 2. And the setting of this is important to understand all of this information in order to understand what's happening in this story. And so we're going to read just a couple of verses here at the beginning of Ruth chapter 2. It says, "Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband," and that idea of a kin relationship, that's going to become really important, particularly later in the story in chapters 3 and 4. But this is a relative of Elimelech. It says he's a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. And so right off the bat, we're being introduced to Boaz, and Boaz is being described in terms that put him in a very positive light. He's sounding kind of like the Lot is described in the book of Genesis, of being a man of some prominence, of being of wealth, that he's in the city gates. He's a wise individual. And so this text is already setting us up to understand that Boaz is a good guy. And that is surprising a little bit because remember, Ruth is set during the time of Judges. And so we're kind of prepped by the timeline of this book to expect women to be mistreated by men. We're expecting some of the same stories we saw in the book of Judges with, again, the Levite's concubine. We're expecting that kind of bad behavior on the part of Israel. But we're told in contrast to that, that Boaz is a man of faithfulness, he's a man of righteousness, and he's a man that looks out for those less fortunate. And that really comes to fruition in this idea of gleaning. Now, that's a word that most of us probably don't recognize unless you're involved in large-scale wheat farming, which I know for a fact I'm definitely not. But this word has a really big connection to the law of Moses. So if you flip over in your Bibles over to the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 24, this idea of gleaning has a really important place in the practices of Israel. And it was specifically designed to be a way that Israel would show mercy and show grace to people that were of less fortunate standings. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 19, we see an example of this where Moses says, "When you reap your harvest in the field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the alien, for the orphan, and for the widow, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive tree, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the alien, for the orphan, and for the widow." So this illustrates a really important concept in the law of Moses where you were to allow for those who were less fortunate to reap some of the benefit from your agricultural produce. Remember, the land is a big concept in Israel because this is a gift from God, this land of Canaan that they dwell in. It's bountiful because God's presence is there. And so they were not supposed to just farm every single little bit of their land and take every piece of the crop, every grape or every piece of grain. Instead, they were actually to leave some of these pieces for people that might not be as fortunate, people that were orphaned, people that were widowed, people that might not have their own land due to whatever circumstances. And they were to show mercy to these underprivileged people because they had been shown mercy by God. And one of those classes of people that you left the corners of your field available to was foreigners. And so Ruth is one of these protected minorities, one of these classes that suffers from perhaps a lack of opportunity. And so Boaz is going to be shown through this idea of gleaning as not just a good man or a kind man, but he is a faithful man who knows the law of Moses and seeks to apply it. And so there's going to be a lot of hints of this throughout the text. So Trey, what else are you seeing that kind of gives us some hints of who Boaz is?
Yeah, moving forward, when we think about Boaz and how he's characterized here, this generous man who not only is he good and he's kind, but that word kindness, in fact, it's going to be used later on of Boaz. It's the word hesed. And the reason why that is important is that is the word that is used to talk about um, the covenant loyalty, the steadfast love. Maybe you're reading your Bible and you read steadfast love of God. That's that same word. And that's the exact attribute that Boaz has. And Ruth actually is going to demonstrate that later on in chapter 3. So that's going to become very important that he is godlike. As Andrew said, he is faithful in this way. He cares about the poor, he cares about the afflicted. And that's absolutely what we see in the character of God himself, that he's one who looks out for the orphans, for the widows. He cares about the foreigner, the downtrodden. Um, and so we're going to see that as we go throughout this story. In fact, Greg is going to pick up here in just a few moments, talking more about the character of Boaz, starting in verse 11 here in a little bit. But before we talk about Boaz a little bit more, I want us to switch and talk about Ruth and what she is doing as she goes to this field. So the narrator has set up this scene that Naomi has this relative, as Andrew pointed out. He's this wealthy man. That's kind of how he's being portrayed, this worthy man of the clan of Elimelech. His name is Boaz. So the narrator has told us that, and is keeping us in suspense a little bit. Well, who is Boaz? How is he going to become important in this story? Well, by the time we get to verse 3, it says, so she set out and went and gleaned in a field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And that word that she happened to come there, I think that is trying to signal what the narrator's doing. He's trying to signal us to see something more. That it's not just happenstance, it's not just accident, but what we're really to see here is that the fact that she's going to the field where she has this kin relationship, at least through Naomi, there's this kin relationship that's going to become very important in the story. Well, God's hand is behind this. And so when it says she happened to do this, it's kind of like what we see in the book of Esther. I think we mentioned this last time, back in our discussion of chapter 1, where there's not really an overt presence of God, and that same is true here in this book, but he's working behind the scenes. And so her happening to come to this field at this time, come to this place at this time, I think is signaling us that God is working behind the scenes. And you see that even more when you get into verse 4. Behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And I don't know how often you use the word behold just in your everyday conversation. You're telling a story of what you saw going on today, and a kid runs out and grabs a ball in the middle of the street, and behold, there was a car and it swerved. No, nobody tells stories like that, right? But when the biblical authors are using that word, it's a wake-up call. It's like, behold, something is important, so pay attention. Boaz is coming from Bethlehem, and again, let's remember what we should be thinking about with Bethlehem, the city of David, whom Boaz is ultimately going to become, or is the ancestor of. And so setting that up, Boaz happens to come at this place where Ruth happens to be and find herself in this field that belongs to him, the relative. And so as we continue to look throughout this text, there's going to be some very important things. So Boaz takes notice of Ruth, doesn't tell us what caught his eye about her, but he takes notice of her, asks the workers that she's been working with about her, who is this woman? Who does she belong to? And the workers respond, and how they respond is very important, because the narrator has already pointed this out. Lips of these workers, she's the Moabite. She's the Moabite woman. She's the Moabitess. And why that's important is the fact that Israelites and Moabites did not have good dealings with each other. There was no meshing with Israelites and Moabites. We talked about this a little bit last time. Just a lot of the tension that was there, some of the history that was there between them. And that's going to continue to be an important trope as we go throughout this, that she is a Moabite woman. And yet, she's acting completely out of character. And again, Greg is going to talk about that here a little bit more, but I want to focus on 8 through 10 now. Because after Boaz learns about her, this woman who has come and she's working in the field, by the way, except for a short rest, and I think that's cluing us into some of the character of Ruth, that she is this hardworking, diligent type of a person, Boaz speaks to her and he says, don't go into another field. And it's not just that he doesn't want her to go into another field because he just kind of likes her and wants to have her nearby. It's not just that. It's also the fact that he doesn't know what's going to happen to her if she goes into another field. You remember, this is the time period of the judges, and very terrible things are happening to women during this time. And so he's setting that up here a little bit, and it's going to be brought to our attention more explicitly later on the lips of Naomi, when she talks about in verse 22 that if she were to go into another field, there's a chance that she might be assaulted. And so that care that Andrew talked about, that Boaz is showing for her, that beneficence and benevolence that he is demonstrating in protecting this foreigner who probably would not otherwise have been protected. Well, Greg, as we transition to looking at Ruth and her response, you have anything more to say about that?
Lo and behold, I think there are some thoughts we should share here. In verse 10, as you look at Boaz showing that great generosity, and I think that's highlighted really through the second part of this chapter, notice how gracious he is, but also Ruth's reaction. In verse 10, then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Now, this is critical for a couple of reasons. I think there's an Old Testament story parallel, but there's also a God and us parallel here. The only way to be pleasing to God is for us to recognize in his sight, I'm nothing. That's really hard. I don't know about y'all, but for me, being an American citizen and growing up with at least some understanding that there is a God and I need to obey him, I think it's difficult sometimes to say, I'm the worst. And Ruth here is by resume supposed to be the worst. She's a Moabite. She's a widow. She has no help. She generally can offer not much. She's kind of just a taker. And, before you look at the story of Ruth, you don't know what her work ethic is. And yet, as Trey, as you rightfully said, in the story, what do we learn about Ruth? Well, she's loyal. She's faithful. Back in chapter 1, she pledged herself to the God of the Israelites, to Jehovah. And then also you see that she has this strong work ethic in which she stays out. She takes barely any breaks, essentially, barely any rest in verse 7. And so here she is saying, hey, I am unworthy. I am this foreigner. I'm an outsider. Why are you caring for me? So we can see what position Boaz is in. And in verse 11, notice what he says. He answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me. How you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Boaz says, I know who you are. I know what your loyalty to me is. I see your humility, and what am I going to do for you? The answer for Ruth is everything. Boaz essentially becomes everything for her. If you go back into verse 8, 9, and 10, what does he hold back? He gives her protection. He offers her food. He offers her drink. Later, you're going to see he doesn't just offer her these basics, and we'll really hit on the generosity in these later verses of chapter 2 of Boaz. He gives her everything and more that she would need. This is what God does for us, but there's always one sticking point. God loves everyone, yes. God desires that all men be saved, of course. So what's the sticking line there? It's my humility. Do I realize that I am the foreigner, that I bring no value to God, but that he has placed value within me, being made in his image, that humbly I can seek him, and that to do that requires sacrifice, not just of will or pride, but also notice this in verse 10, she had said, why do you give me favor? In verse 11, you have left your father's house, basically. You've left everything you're accustomed to. Who does that make us think of? Well, it makes us think of Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, what did God say? You go to that land I'll show you. Now, I don't know about y'all, but when I go on vacation, I like to know everything I'm going to do first. I'm one of those really fun to be with people. I want to know what road we're going on. I want to know what hotel we're staying in. I want to know what we're going to do from each hour of the day. Isn't everyone, by the way, super pumped to take a vacation with me at some point? We want to know where we're going. God tells Abraham, you go, and by the way, leave everything you're comfortable with. Leave your father's house. Ruth has done that. In chapter 1, we highlighted that. She's left basically everything and everyone except Naomi. And that's all she has left. But Boaz shows this great care for her. She's like Abraham. Verse 13 in response, and she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord. You have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. One of the hard parts about being like Abraham is that I have to give up control of my life. This is the difficulty. On vacation, I like to think I have control. By the way, has there ever been a year that busted the illusion of control like 2020? We have no control, and if that wasn't obvious before now, it's very obvious now. Ruth has hit this bottom point. She's choosing to trust Boaz, and he is giving her all that she could ever need and want. In fact, if you look at Psalm 91, this language that he used in verse 12, in this prayer for her, this prayer that God would protect her, in Psalm 91, look at a couple of these verses here. Verse 1, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Notice verse 4, he will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. God is a shield and refuge to those who humbly seek him. And this is what she's doing. Ruth says, I'm laying myself at your feet. I am so thankful for your grace and mercy. And that is a great attribute to Ruth. The question is, do I show that in my life? That's going to be a difficult thing. And so, Andrew, as we look at verse 14 through 16, it really becomes interesting. What is this going to look like? What is this relationship that's now been announced that Boaz is going to take care of her, that Ruth is a diligent worker? How does that transition? What do you think about that?
Yeah, as we continue to talk about this idea of generosity, what we see is that, again, the law has set up an expectation of what to do. And again, if we want to look at another passage in Leviticus chapter 19, we even kind of get probably the specific law that Boaz is referencing here. Leviticus 19 and verse 9, it says, now when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, nor shall you glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. And so again, as we've said, Yahweh has set up this idea that, don't take every single thing in your land, leave some of the things. If something happens to fall, don't worry about picking it up, leave some of the scraps for people. Boaz is going above and beyond that, though. He's not just leaving the corners of the field. He's not just, hey, if you happen to drop some things, don't pick it up. Let Ruth get whatever that scrap may be. Look at what he does at verse 14. He says, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here that you may eat of bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left. So not only is Boaz allowing this, again, Moabite widow who has nothing to offer, nothing to trade for this, he says, not only will I, yes, allow you to do what the law tells me to do, but I'm going to feed you. I'm going to make sure that you're strong enough to do this. I'm going to make sure that you are well fed and taken care of, and I'm protecting you from anything that may happen. I'm making sure you're, as Greg pointed out, under the wing of my protection, but I'm also going to feed you. I'm also going to make sure that you're feeling okay. I'm going to make sure that you are protected. I'm treating you just like I would any of my people. And again, she's a Moabite. We would not expect this to be the way that an Israelite would treat a Moabite. As we've seen in the book of Judges, Israelites don't even treat other Israelites that well. And yet Boaz has this level of character that he's feeding a Moabite, one of the enemies of Israel. Then it says in verse 15, when she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. Also, you shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. So now Boaz is not just letting her come to the field and, kind of picking up the scraps. He says, hey, let her go into my grain. Let her go into my prepared bundles and let her take some out if she wants. And you go ahead and help her. You do some of the work for her. You take out these pieces of grain and you leave it for her. He is going so far above and beyond what the law expects. And I think this really goes to the idea of what was the purpose of the law of Moses. And Boaz is exemplifying that it's not, okay, do this bare minimum, and then that's what God is looking for. God is looking for the law of Moses to transform Israel into people that overflow with mercy and grace toward the foreigner and the widow and the orphan. And Boaz is showing that the ideal Israelite, and that's really how he's kind of being portrayed in this chapter. He is an Israelite who has embodied the law. And so he doesn't just go to the bare minimum to do this. He seeks to do everything he can for this young woman, Ruth, particularly because she is such a shining example of an ideal foreigner, of a foreigner who has come, has abandoned her land for the sake of Yahweh. And it's almost as if they're they're kind of feeding off each other's generosity. They're feeding off each other's good works. And they want to do good for one another because they understand, and I think they see that kind of kindred spirit of love for the Lord. And so this really just highlights how much Boaz is being held up as this is what it's supposed to be like. This is what Israel is supposed to look like. And again, after having just looked at the book of Judges, we've just been filled with examples of this is not what's supposed to be happening. Everything is wrong. There's no king. There's no following of the law. There's no love for their neighbor. Boaz is this just breath of fresh air of, okay, this is what it's supposed to look like. This is what happens when God's people do what God has asked them to do. And when they imbibe that law to the point that it becomes a natural outpouring of mercy and grace. And really this continues. We see then kind of as the day comes to a close, we see just how generous Boaz has been. And Greg, I think you got some thoughts on that as we get into verse 17.
Yeah, I think you nailed the idea of Boaz going above and beyond. And when you think about that, that's important for two reasons. Number one, on our side, how generous should we be? Well, how generous has God been with us? How generous do we want others to be when we're in need? And really, you see that in verse 17. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. Now, there are all kinds of reference points for how much this is, whether it's 22 liters or 3/5 of a bushel. The point is, this was not scrapped leftovers. Ruth didn't have to go and do all that work. Boaz is taking care of her, giving her more than enough. Now, that's important on the first front. We need to be generous. But here's the second part. Remember, who is Ruth self-identifying as? Correctly, a Moabite foreigner, a widow Moabite foreigner, a woman, widow, foreigner. She's all kinds of strikes against her from an old law standpoint, at least in the way that men treated women. But under the old law, God shows that he values all people, and especially those who are in need. But notice, what does Ruth do? This becomes interesting. She's in need. Now, Boaz has gone above and beyond what she has. How does she respond? Right? She has help. She has more than enough. Does she kind of sit back and go, man, it's great to receive mercy, and then do nothing? Well, no, that's not Ruth at all. From the very beginning through the end of Ruth, she shows what and how we react to the grace of God. How do we respond? What should we do? Notice what Ruth does. In verse 19, her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." Ruth doesn't view the aid and the additions to the help in getting more and more food as a time to take her foot off the gas. She says, I still need to work. He's taking care of me, but what do I owe him? I owe him everything. You see, the parallels aren't that hard to draw here. When God shows us grace and mercy, when we least deserve it, and let's be clear, Romans 5 says we, at least of all of us, deserve it. We are described in Romans 5 as enemies, sinners, and needing to be reconciled to God. At that time, Christ died for us. God demonstrated his own love towards us, Romans 5:8. And while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So how do we respond to God's great grace and mercy? Loving, sacrificial living. Every day, I have to dedicate myself to God and say, I am thankful. Ruth was thankful for what Boaz did. And so she repaid him by working hard. And you say, well, where is the direct line here? Well, as you look at what God has done for us, the answer is everything. What did Boaz do for her? Everything. So what does she do? Take advantage of it in a positive way, or we might call it Ephesians 5 language, redeeming the time. So we need to make sure that as we are generous to others, we give above and beyond. Don't try to just give the bare minimum. Don't try to figure out what the least we can do to please God and please others. Be like Boaz, be a giver. Take care fully. You remember in the parable of the Good Samaritan, how much did the Samaritan take care of the man who was injured? Did he say, all right, I'm going to throw you a couple coins maybe, and hopefully you'll figure it out? Well, no, not at all. He took time. He made sure all of his needs were met. He cared about the soul. We have to care about the souls of others. Number two, when someone cares about our soul, when we see what God has done for us, I have to realize I do owe him everything. What does that look like? Submitting to him humbly, being thankful like Ruth was to Boaz, but also likewise spreading that love outward, realizing that I need to love like God loves. And so there's this kindness theme in the chapter here, Trey, and I know you're going to capitalize on this as we get towards the end of this. What do you see in kindness really popping out of either Boaz or Ruth or the whole combination of it?
Yeah, so as we get to this final section in 20 through 23, Ruth has given this report about all the things that Boaz has done for her. and specified now, okay, this was Boaz who did it. And so Naomi responds, she says to her daughter-in-law, and I'll read verse 20 here. It says, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. And we read that, and the question is, well, whose kindness are we talking about? And really, grammatically, it could go with either it's Boaz who has been kind, or it's the Lord who has been kind. And maybe what is going on here, maybe the author or the narrator is doing that intentionally to sort of blur this line and blur this distinction between God's actions and Boaz's actions. Because what we've already seen with Boaz is he's an Israelite who, in contradistinction to all of the other Israelites, or many of the other Israelites at this time, he's one who is following after God, who's showing himself to be faithful to God, who's taking in and taking on the character of God. And now he is acting kind like God, or even in God's kindness as God is blessing this family, even the living and the dead. And I think by blessing Ruth and Naomi, that Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion, this whole family is being blessed because of this act of kindness. And so as Naomi is experiencing it, as Ruth is experiencing it, it's God's kindness through the conduit of Boaz. And I think that's important. Because as we get into this book, this word kindness, it's been used of God already. Here we've got sort of an ambiguous reference where maybe it's talking about God, maybe it's talking about Boaz, maybe it's talking about both. Later on, it's going to be used of Ruth. And she is the one who has shown great kindness. And that is what, as we get to really the climax of the story, that is what draws Boaz to her and ignites this relationship, that he's noticed this same trait in her. And it's a trait that we ought to have as well, this generosity, as we've talked about, but it's more than just a generous sort of disposition. It's more than just leaving a little bit on the bone for others to have. It's giving from ourself and from our heart. In fact, earlier, as Boaz and Ruth are having this conversation, he's offering to provide for her and support her. Verse 13, it says that he spoke kindly to her. And literally, he's speaking from his heart, that this is something he cares very deeply about. And so this kindness, again, Boaz being the conduit of how God is working in this situation. Very important for us to see that. But as we can end this section, I do want to draw attention to verse 23. And verse 23 says, so she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. And so she is continuing to work, as Greg talked about, work diligently. She's almost this sort of quasi-employee. She's not really an employee, but she kind of is, and she's getting some of the benefits. But what happens in a few months when the wheat harvest and the barley harvest, what happens when they end? And that really sets up chapter 3, because there's the potential, at least, for Ruth and Naomi to go back to the position that they were in before the harvest started. And that is these poor widows that don't have any means to provide for themselves. And so again, they're going to be relying on some sort of kindness from this close relative. Andrew, I think you have some things to say about this relative of Boaz and what it means for him to be this kinsman redeemer.
Yeah, so we talked about this idea in chapter 1. Naomi had made the statement to Ruth and Orpah that I don't have any sons right now, and even if I did, you'd have to wait until he grew up for him to marry one of you. And we talked about this idea of the levirate marriage, of the idea that if a man dies with no children, his brother would then take up that function, would have a child. That first child would continue the name, the lineage of that older brother who had died. Again, kind of the famous story of that is with Judah and Tamar. We're seeing here allusions to that, and we've seen it kind of seeded throughout. We have Boaz introduced in this text in chapter 2 as a close relative, that he is of Elimelech's clan. And Naomi even confirms it for us in verse 20, that Naomi said to her, the man is our relative, he is one of our closest relatives. And so we've already been kind of primed to introduce that Naomi's thought is that, if I had a son, we could fix this issue, because, she would just marry Ruth or Orpah and we'd go there. Now we're being talked about that maybe there is this kinsman redeemer, maybe there is this close redeemer who's going to be able to fulfill that role. And so it hasn't been fully drawn out, but it's being teased that maybe Boaz is not just the short-term answer, but maybe also a long-term answer, like Trey alluded to. The barley and the wheat harvest, this is a period of about 2 months in Israel's agricultural calendar. And so, right now they're being provided for, and Ruth is being given generously. She might be able to provide for a couple months after that, but there's got to be some sort of long-term solution. And so the text is already kind of alluding to maybe Boaz is both the short-term and the long-term solution for all of this. And so as the text closes, I think we've got just some really good applications that have been made. We've talked a lot about the idea of generosity, and I really appreciate how Greg put it. A lot of times when we talk about generosity, when we talk about giving, when we talk about the idea of supporting those who are less fortunate, so many times I think we can come at it with the attitude of like, okay, well, what's the minimum that I need to be giving? What do I need to do to fulfill that law? We talk about it, giving in a congregational sense. What is that magic number that I need to give in order to have fulfilled the law and the command? Is it 10%? Is it, 1% of my paycheck, whatever it is? And that mindset is totally alien to what we see in the book of Ruth here. We see that Boaz is going above and beyond, that Boaz is looking for ways that he can be generous. He's looking for ways he can provide protection. He's looking for ways that he can make sure Ruth and Naomi are being supported. And so this theme of generosity, it just comes screaming through the text. And it really should cause us to question, if I've been blessed like Boaz has, and Boaz clearly has a very healthy attitude towards his wealth, towards his ability to provide. It's not something that he's hoarding. It's not something that he's keeping close to his chest. He's looking to use it for people's good. Is that how we treat our wealth? Is that how we treat, again, most of us being in America, the fact that we probably have excess? We probably do have a lot more than just the bare necessities. Do we have the ability to see our wealth not as just something for our use, but as something that should be used to help those that we come into contact with? Greg, what do you see here as we kind of close out? What are some applications you're seeing?
So I know in your wrap up there, I think you did a good job speaking about Boaz. But behold, there's more to it even. You have Ruth, on the other hand. How do we respond to that generosity? I think it's amazing the lengths to which Boaz went to give her protection. But on our perspective, we're not the God figure in this story. And Boaz is a man who had flaws, undoubtedly. But he does have this God-like attribute of selflessness, of reaching out and providing for someone in need. But when I am the person who's been reached out to, when I realize how great God is, and all of that refuge, all of that protection, all that he provides for me, how do I access that peace? How do I respond to it? Well, there's only one possible way: falling down on my knees, worshiping and being thankful. You may be familiar with the song, I Surrender All. This is what Ruth has done. She is surrendering all. She realizes she is entitled to nothing, and yet she worked hard anyway. When Boaz rewards her for working hard, for seeking God, praying and telling her to remember, by the way, that God is the key, that God will bless her, and that God would continue to do so, she continues to work hard. And so when I think about the grace of God, that's not a license to be lazy. In fact, it's the opposite. It's a challenge to be the best version of myself that God sees. Not that I can be, not that I might be inclined to work towards, but to say, God sees me and God made me. I have value in his sight no matter what the world sees. So what do I owe him? Everything. I'm not in control, but I can trust the one who is. I can't provide for myself only, but there is a God who gives every good and perfect gift. I need God every day. That needs to be a prayer. That needs to be a way of life. Ruth shows that we can be thankful, gracious, and still hardworking within the framework of a gracious and giving God. And so, Trey, whether it's Boaz or Ruth, this chapter is full of all kinds of application. We'll give you kind of the last word here. What do you see in Ruth chapter 2 that really stands out in application?
Yeah, Greg, I really appreciate you pointing to God and the fact that we need to depend on him, and that he's the one who gives, he's the one who provides, and he's the one who sees us. As I think about this story, as I think about this chapter in particular, Ruth, as we've noted several times, there was no reason for anybody to take notice of her. She's a widow. She's a Moabite. You're looking at her, and typically the way that you would have looked at somebody who's come into this sort of situation, who's had this befall on them, well, it's not just chance. You are somebody who has become poor because you have made an egregious mistake. You have committed a great sin. This is often how Israelites thought about the relationship between sin and God and the world and blessings. But Boaz, or rather God, is seeing Ruth, and God is seeing Naomi, and I think that's important as he is providing for this family. But he's not the only one who sees. Boaz also sees. And the point of application I want to take from that is, we ought not be the type of people who overlook maybe those that everybody else is overlooking. So maybe there's somebody of a different social status, a different class, maybe of a different race, maybe they're just kind of weird. Let's be honest, there are some weird people out there, and especially even in here among God's people. And yet, what do we tend to do with those sort of people? But distance them, separate ourselves from them. But Boaz is looking, and Boaz sees this woman whom nobody else would have seen. The other thing about that is, not only do we need to be people that are seeing others, but we need to be people who are worthy of being seen. And so Ruth has this loyalty, she has this kindness, she has everything. She's embodying everything that an Israelite should be, and what most Israelites are not at this time. And that is, I think, what compels Boaz to take a second look at her and see her as he does. And so know that your kindness, that your goodness, that your hard work, it's seen by those whose opinion matters. I heard this quote, and I don't remember where I heard it, but I think it's really good. God's is the only court of opinion that matters. And we might add to that the people of God as well, when they are seeing and looking through his lens and through his perspective. And so if you're maybe living your life and you're trying to serve God, know that God is seeing you, and there's probably good brethren that are looking at you and appreciative for what you have done as well. Well, Andrew, I appreciate this study, and I appreciate you involving us in this. Ruth is such a great book, not only from its content, but also in its form and the way that it's laid out. It keeps us in suspense, and I just cannot wait till we get to chapter 3 next time. Thank you so much, Andrew and Greg.
Yeah, we're absolutely going to get to see, hopefully next time we'll get into chapter 3, where we're going to see a lot of these threads are all going to come together. We're going to, Naomi is going to kind of make a return to prominence in the story, perhaps not in a great way. We're going to talk about that and how this plan that emerges in chapter 3, seeking to solve the problem that we talked about in verse 23 about, that we've got a 2-month period where we're going to be provided for, but what's that next step? Both Naomi and Ruth are going to have a plan for how to work through that. And we're going to talk about that next time as we get to kind of, again, the climax of this book. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to continue this study. Grateful both again to Trey and Greg for joining us in this. Can't wait to get into Ruth chapter 3 next time. Thank you so much. We'll see you then.